Okay, so thank you to this invitation to speak here. Thank you, Shaila, and the other members of the committee for this chance. I'm sorry I'm not there. Again, Shaila, I'm sorry. But I got double booked, and I just got back from another conference just actually 2-3 hours ago. So I'm running conferences together. So my apologies for that. And one of the problems with that is I haven't been able to get an idea of what people are talking about and the themes of the conference as people take those up. So I'm sorry, I'm just speaking into a fairly empty knowledge of what the discussion has been about so far. But so what I did was I took up the ideas that are in the title of the conference, particularly the idea of metamorphosis and also then of decoloniality and language education. So I thought I would take the idea of metamorphosis seriously to see where that takes us. So a rough overview of what I'm going to talk about. As I said, I'll get into the idea of metamorphosis a bit. Maybe you didn't mean it that seriously, but I thought I'd take it up a bit. Talk a bit about ontological curiosity or skepticism and deconstructivism. Then I want to look very briefly at things like world Englishes, unequal Englishes, blackfellow English, Southern English, and where they take us in relation to metamorphosis and not. Then I want to look at some challenges to current linguistic thinking, which we can see as decolonial challenges around colonialism, racism, nationalism, universalism, anthropocentrism, and so on. But I want to suggest that only takes us so far. And we also need to look at alternative ways of thinking. So I want to talk a bit about the idea of water epistemologies, and I hope that becomes clear. That's something that Symphony Marconi and I have been working with. And then conclude fairly briefly through some ideas of how we can think forward with decolonialism, entanglements, assemblages, and things like that. So let me get into metamorphosis. What intrigued me when I started to think about metamorphosis is that it actually implies very major change, right? Metamorphosis isn't just a minor change. In its full metamorphosis, and the examples here are sort of half and full. Metamorphosis for caterpillars becoming butterflies or moths it's almost a complete change. And there's one line of biology which actually says maybe they're actually different creatures, that a caterpillar is not the same creature as what it becomes as a butterfly. That line of thinking is fairly discredited in real biology, but it's a kind of interesting thought that we assume that a caterpillar is a kind of young butterfly, but in fact it's kind of tempting to think that actually maybe they're actually two different creatures that happen to kind of become each other. Anyway, that's not quite. It seems that biologically that's a bit too risky way of thinking. But the important point is that these are radical changes, and so we need to think a bit of what that might mean when we're thinking about language metamorphosis. I wanted to raise a bit this idea of deconstructivism has been floating around the last few years. It's really only McSwan, Jeff McSwan, has been using it. And he uses it as a critique of what we might call, what Lionel Wee calls ontological skepticism. That is to say, we maintain a certain curiosity, a skepticism about language ontologies, right? What languages are, what both language and languages are. And it's been interesting that, McSwan has been critical of this move in relation to translanguaging and so on. And I don't want to get into those debates at all, but it intrigued me actually when I started looking. Actually, the term deconstructivism started to interest me, and it's more used actually as a term in architecture. And so the Guggenheim Bilbao, or the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, is an example of Frank Gehry's deconstructivist architecture. And what interests me in that as a term, there's kind of an irony here in McSwan using it so negatively, that deconstructivism, I mean, if you're an architect, you're not much useful as an architect if you only pull things apart. I mean, you have to have a constructive agenda. Now, there may be a quite radical one. And when we look at these buildings, we think, God, they're really not recognizable as buildings, at least in a number of ways. I mean, they're really what that group of people, and they were influenced by people like Derrida, that's where the deconstruction comes from. They wanted to pull apart, deconstruct architecture, and then, of course, reassemble it. Now, the Guggenheim Museum maybe isn't our ideal model here. It's an extremely expensive piece of wild architecture, and we might be better putting money into social housing. But nevertheless, it does present this idea that we say, yes, when we pull things apart, I mean, all decent critical work has aimed at reconstruction, reconstitution, reassemblage, whatever we want to call it. And I think people sometimes, McSwan in particular, criticize the work that Marconi and I did when we talked about disinventing. And people often forget that the title of our book was Disinventing and Reconstituting Language. It was always about, okay, what do we do once we've questioned what things are? So I want to just point to this, the fact that critical work always needs its reconstructive elements, and in most cases has always had it. So those who criticize what they see as skepticism, deconstructivism, whatever they want to call it, kind of miss the point of where it then goes. And I like this quote from Muniz, who's a Brazilian black activist, and she says, when your linguistic identity is denied, your only choice, and translated here, is to rewrite, to reinvent, to reset the very idea of language. I think, yeah, that's the point. So just going back to Metamorphosis briefly, I was just playing a bit with rewriting the beginning of the English translation here of Kafka's book, which is one of those things we often associate with Metamorphosis, right? So one morning, as I rewrite Kafka, when English woke up from troubled dreams, it found itself transformed into a quite different entity. So the question is, if we're looking at metamorphosis of language, how far can we imagine that difference to be? What are the limits to our linguistic imagination? So if we accept the point that languages may not be the same things, and I'll come back to that point, how different can they be? So one domain we know that's kind of pushed the boundaries a bit here with reimagining languages, of course, being the World Englishes and English lingua franca frameworks. For me, I think the problem with them is they've done a lot of very useful work. Let's say that right from the start. I mean, they've challenged native speakerism. They've challenged the dominance of what's called inner circle English and so on. But I think what they don't do is bring to crisis the very ideas of language that we need to question once we look at the global spread of English and other languages. It's also subject to what Britta Schneider, and I'll come back to her later, calls methodological nationalism. And so looking at world Englishes, she says the problem here is really these Englishes get reinscribed into Bangladesh English, Indian English, Pakistan English, Singapore English. There's always on national lines, and that's not necessarily a very useful way to go. And as she also points out, those descriptions are then often based on the speech of a small Western-oriented elite, which is taken to be representative of all members. And I, in a sense, that's the people who are here in this audience from Bangladesh, who become sort of representative nationally of a supposed variety. Of course, we also know there are varieties within nations, and Isabel Martin's been very good on showing, say, in the Philippines, that we can't simply locate countries within circles. It just doesn't work because of questions of access and so on. So my problem really with World English, and I won't get into the ELF either, is that it doesn't really do enough questioning, even though it's done some useful work in kind of reframing how we think about English. And Brutio kind of rather bluntly calls it a 20th century construct that has outlived its usefulness. Then there's the work on unequal Englishes, which takes us a bit further and really questions and points to the need, and this is particularly the work of Rani Tupas in the Philippines, of the need not just to look at different Englishes, but to challenge the inequalities implied in them. And Mario Saraceni makes this important point here, that just as one aspect of how inequality manifests itself and affects people's lives, language is intertwined with unequal distribution of wealth, power, imbalance, racism, gender discrimination, and the demarcation lines between social classes. So looking at language only may be seriously reductive. So it's the point we always need to look at everything that's going on in and around languages if we want to understand how those work. And it's no good just trying to come up with descriptions of varieties. And Ryuko Kubota, in a quote that's quite often asks this, can all English users, regardless of their racial, gender, socioeconomic, and other backgrounds, equally transgress linguistic boundaries? And of course, that's going to remain a question however we start to frame our languages. I want to move very briefly to a couple of other proposals here. And the first one is starting to emerge. One of the problems that, I think one of the many problems with world English is it didn't know what to do with pidgins, creoles, and Salikoko Mufwene has critiqued it for that. And something like Aboriginal English in Australia really doesn't have much of a place. Australia is kind of supposed to be an inner circle country, and therefore Aboriginal English is possibly a variety of that, which becomes a really problematic definition. Do we then have another way of framing it? Because speakers may or may not be first language speakers of English and so on. And so a term that's starting to emerge now is something like blackfella English. And I like this quote from a recent book on Indigenous languages in Australia, but talking about English here. And Sharon Davis, who's an educator, Aboriginal educator, and he says, with our ancestral languages stolen and being the adaptive people us blackfellas are, we took the way the colonizer talked and forced us to talk and decolonized it to suit our needs. So blackfella English becomes a more political, decolonial enunciation of a way of using English here. And I'm interested, of course, in Hamid's recent proposal, and I think I saw Hamid in the audience there. Greetings. And his writing about English as a Southern language, which again takes up this idea of how do we locate English in the global South, which isn't the same as the world English's framing of English as an Asian language or something, but it's, again, looking at as he says, it's looking at knowledge, experiences, tools. So our use of English is reflective of our linguistic repertoires and life circumstances. It's really relocating English in other ways in that way. But I want to move on here now to some critiques of really the sort of coloniality of linguistics. And I think these are important, but I also want to come back to the point that these are kind of the easy part. We can go on critiquing linguistics as a colonial project and apply linguistics as colonial projects. We also have to have that kind of reconstructive agenda. It doesn't have to look like the Guggenheim Museum, but it's got to look like something. But let's just focus on this a bit. So the first 2 points I want to make have to do with colonialism generally, and then also the idea of extraction. So Vanek-Sundlova and Makalela, in their book on decolonizing multilingualism in Africa, and they talk about the way that mainstream understandings of multilingualism, mother tongue education, additive bilingual, and so on, multilingual national language policies exemplify the subtle manifestations of coloniality of language. Right? And this is a really important argument that's been emerging over the last few years, right? That even when we talk about things that as linguists we sometimes see as good, like mother tongue education, multilingual language policies, bilingual education, the way they're framed in how languages are described and put into policy remains caught within a colonial view of language. And I was just in Canberra yesterday talking with Indigenous educators about some of these issues around how the way we frame languages and multilingualism still doesn't fit the way so there's this gap between these framings of language, and they continue colonial logic that's very different from what we need to think about. And in this recent book, Charity Hudley and her co-authors talk about colonial oppression is at the heart of linguistics. And the colonial roots and history of the discipline have been interrogated for several decades. Like many fields, they say, like the university system and like academia itself, linguistics still operates according to logics of domination and extraction. And the idea of extraction is something that has been interesting me over the last few years. There's two slightly different uses of the term. Asif Agha actually talks about extractionism, I think. This is extractivism, and it's to look at the way that linguistics has tended to sort of plunder the resources of the global south in order to produce its linguistic theories in the global north. And that's why I kind of like to use an image like this of mining. It's this real extraction of resources that's been going on in linguistics and applied linguistics. Second 2 points, obviously related, have to do with race and the blindness to race within applied linguistics. And I think you've all already heard from the wonderful Senda Dovchin this morning, so I don't need to say much more about this. There's the work in the US going on, particularly on racial linguistics, and Senda tends to talk about linguistic racism. And here, looking at this issue of who can speaking one's language, and as she says, or as they say, symbolic violence takes different forms through both verbal and non-verbal language under the scrutiny of the white gaze, which produces arbitrary power, control, and domination. This is to do with the way that using language gets judged by those in power, who are predominantly white, and related to that, but different in some ways, Symphony McConey has used this term methodological whiteness. And as he says, it points to the failure in applied linguistics to fully acknowledge the role played by race in the structuring of the world, thereby treating white experience as a universal norm in language learning and teaching. And of course, Suresh and some of his colleagues have also written a paper around the kind of whiteness of applied linguistics as a discipline, as a conference, particularly American applied linguistics. So these are clearly things that are deeply embedded in a colonial history and need to be addressed as part of a decolonial project. As I said, I'm interested in the idea of methodological nationalism, as Britta Schneider has described it. Particularly the way we tie language data to nations and assume this easy relation between Singapore English, Indian English, Philippine English, Bangladesh English, whatever, that's the way to describe a variety of English. And I think it's really worth asking why that would be a natural and normal way to think about English on national levels. But I think that applies to all language and all language descriptions. Why do we work with this kind of nationalism underlying what we do methodologically? A slightly different issue is what I've called a liberal egalitarianism of linguistics, and that to me is a sort of underlying philosophies that have become very much part of liberalism, very much part of linguistics, which assumes this parity of languages, so all languages are equal, and we know that that's a kind of dogma, a very typical position of linguistics. All languages are equal, and of course it emerged for very good reasons, right? It was trying to overcome prejudicial views that we have developed and primitive languages and so on. The trouble is, once it becomes this kind of dogma, we can't address other issues around access, inequality, and so on. So liberalism in this way, which tries to say, okay, everything is equal, fails to address difference by just saying that sameness is our way of dealing with inequality. And this idea that all languages are equal, as Joseph and Neumeyer point out, really it's really kind of not very clear what it's supposed to mean. And even though people say we've got lots of empirical evidence, they've kind of reviewed it and say, no, there really isn't. I mean, and it's actually not a very meaningful position other than a slogan, which is interesting from a disciplinary point of view in linguistics, which tends not to like slogan, tends to see itself as apolitical and not to do political slogans like that. Linguistic universalism is another strong aspect of the way linguistics has developed. And this in the sense that all languages are divisions of the same thing. To challenge that, I think, is a really interesting point. I mean, Lionel Weiss says, it works with the assumption that language is a metaphysically invariant and ontologically real phenomenon, and that all humans have language and it's divided into different but equal recognizable entities. So whatever language you have, whether it's Bangla or Walpiri in Central Australia, they're all kind of equal things, equal elements of the same thing called language. What's happened with linguistic anthropology and people really working with languages and also with the kind of ontological turn that's happened in some of that work, we arrive at the point where we start to say, well, are they all the same thing? I mean, do we want to see all languages as just, they're all the same, they just work differently? Or is it possible to start to say, well, maybe they're different kinds of things, and that the universalism that assumes, because we know that the problem with universalism is it never is universal, it's always just assumed that some people, typically in the global north, have come up with some ideas that they then assume everyone else, it applies to everyone else in the world. And so I think there's an interesting challenge to universalism. And even though there are other debates, and I won't get into here, about how universalism can be kind of reused from a decolonial perspective. Another problem is methodological individualism, which has been bothering me for a few years, and I've argued, in fact, that the notion of the idiolect is actually fairly meaningless. I thought, how can an idiolect really mean anything particularly useful? And as part of this individualization of linguistics, we've seen the whole idea that you can, at the very least, you can rest on the assumption that each individual has an internal language capacity. I think that's quite problematic as a way of thinking, and possibly quite meaningless. And I was very glad I realized, looking back, of course, that Suresh has already commented on this in a couple of places, but yes, critiquing this same idea of methodological individualism and the idea that the repository of language, that the individual is the repository of language competence. And I think the last 2 points I wanted to make about this, particular ways that linguistics has worked. Again, I've written quite a lot around the notion of anthropocentrism, which is really putting humans centrally in the picture and ignoring everything else, or putting aside everything else around it. So that can be other animals and the material world, and sort of disconnecting humans from their surrounds. And in order to do that, and part of the linguistic, one of the things that is supposedly separates humans from, at least from other animals, has always been language. And so in order to make that case, linguistics had to then define a very particular, very narrow view of what language is. And they would say, okay, this little view of what language is, which kind of dismisses nonverbal communication and all sorts of other stuff, this is language, and that's not what animals do, because they don't have the same kind of syntactic processing as humans. This has been challenged from a lot of directions, both how we relate to the material world, and again, because Suresh has done a lot of really good work on this. And there's also what's been termed the animal turn in linguistics, and Leonie Kornip's writing a number of articles around the dairy cow. And trying to say, we can understand cows and other animals in social linguistic terms. And so finally, the final point is what I call idealism. I don't really like the term, but it's the sort of it's the idealism. It's also related to what I said before, Asif Agha talking extractionism, where language is kind of taken out of its context and it's dematerialized. So this whole move to say that languages are identifiable, describable, separable, intangible, autonomous systems that linguists can go and discover, and that's sort of very much part of the linguistic way of thinking. So those are kind of 10 problems we could identify in the coloniality of linguistics and how it developed in relation to colonialism. And we could go on. There are doubtless more. And I think that this perspective is really useful, because we can start to see that when we look at coloniality and language, we're not just talking about the dominance of English over other languages, important though that is, and you also had a talk from Robert Phillipson and other talks earlier today, again, talking about that global dominance of English. That's one colonial or imperial domination. But this is getting at the epistemologies that have grown up in relation to colonial and modernist thought. And it's important to try and understand these and to unpack them and see why they often don't work in a lot of other contexts. And for example, some stuff I was writing pretty recently also looking at, for example, is the anthropocentrism and looking at indigenous worldviews in relation to language. And often these distinctions are not made between humans and animals, humans and land, what we call country here in Australia in Aboriginal English or blackfella English. So these are worth critiquing. The problem is, and I think this is what a lot of the work has done, is critique this and these kind of frames of linguistics. We then need to move on and start to propose other ideas. What I want to do next is make a little jump into some other thinking. This is some work that Symphony Marconi and I have been doing. We recently did a paper actually on translanguaging and water. I was a bit surprised. It was for a handbook, and I thought they were going to say, no, that's pushing things too far. But they seem to like it. So we've kind of developed something of a framework, not really a framework, just these terms, hydrosocial, hydrocolonial, and so on. The point about water, I mean, I've been writing a bit about water for a few years and saying, what if we think through water? And Marconi and I came across this book by Karen Ingersoll, who's an indigenous Hawaiian, and she talks about waves of knowing and a seascape epistemology. And she really writes about, from a Hawaiian perspective, the relation to water is central to life, and then water practices, so the swimming, surfing, fishing, and so on. And also from that perspective, and I've been working now on another project, particularly around the Caribbean, but also links to some earlier work in the Pacific, which is trying to think, how does the world look if you live in island communities? And it becomes very different, right? When you shift from the kind of terracentric position a lot of us have in relation to land and then language. So there's some interest. I mean, there's actually a huge body of work on water. So we're interested in the idea of modern water, which again, you might say, well, how can we have, isn't water just water? But there's interesting work talking about modern water, which is really and the author of that says, the iconic thing is the tap, and it's like a northern industrialized water that comes out of a tap clean and purified and without taste, and it should have as little taste as possible. And this is a particular kind of water produced in particular ways in particular regions of the world, which still the majority of people in the world don't have access to. There's a lot of very interesting work around what we call hydrocolonial relations, and that's to do with how the colonialism controlled water and used water to control. So all the ships, including, of course, slave ships. And this can also take us back to the crucial work by Paul Gilroy in the Black Atlantic. And since then, there's been a lot of work on the Black Pacific, Black Mediterranean, and so on. And also, understanding these bodies of water in relation to their colonial histories. And various poets like Walcott kind of talk about the sea as history. We're also interested then in hydrologics, which takes up Ingersoll's particular ways of framing things through water, what she calls waterscape epistemologies. There's ways of thinking and being in water that they tend to question the ideas of the individual and the separability of humans and other creatures, right? That comes through thinking through water. Three other ways of framing this. I was interested in developing the idea of the hydrocommons, and that's really to do with the ownership of water. And this whole fact that in neoliberalism we've had the move to own water, and we sometimes just need to step back and think, how on earth do we end up in a world where some people own the water? It's owned privately and then sold to us as people. This is a remarkable and sad state of things, place to be in. And one of the things that's actually come out in the United Kingdom has been the problem, as always, as with everything they privatize in the UK, such as trains, which don't work, and water. And now they've got big problems of pollution because the private companies that weirdly own water are also not looking after the infrastructure. They've just bought the water. And so there's now major problems of pollution on the coast and in rivers and so on in the UK. And of course, as we know, globally, there are all sorts of inequalities of access to water. There's dirty water. There are dams. There are battles. A whole lot of what's going on in the Middle East is also very much linked to access to water and the stopping of access to water. So the hydrocommons, I found a really useful way of thinking. Also, hydromateriality helps us look about things like flows. And of course, when we think about translanguaging and flows, we go, okay, this is a very easy relation to say, okay, and Emmy and I wrote about fluidity of flows of language. But one of the things that came when McConey and I started to think more carefully about this was the idea that if we start with, rather than just saying, okay, we want to map language onto water flows and say, well, language is more like a stream. So no, what happens if we start with the point that obviously water flows, right? I mean, not always, and there are conditions on which it does, but a basic condition of water is fluidity. And if we start with language as fluid, rather than saying, well, we've got fixity and then it can become fluid, you start with language as fluid, like water. You start to think rather differently about what language is. And so from there, we develop what we can call a hydropolitical standpoint, which makes it possible to examine decolonial questions about language as a social, political, material set of possibilities. So that's just an example of kind of taking something rather different like water and trying to say, what happens if I think through that rather than land and material and terracentric points of view? So I'm just using that as an example of kind of thinking differently that doesn't just work with that challenge to coloniality in traditional ways. So I want to move in this last part just to some clearer reflections on ways forward. And the first thing I want to look at is this idea of the decolonial imagination. And this is taken up and written in the recent terrific article by Hamid and Sultan and Rashid in Applied Linguistics this year. And they talk about the decolonial research imagination, as they say, is not a passive pursuit of colonial Eurocentric views. By definition, it reflects a decolonial vision and research future that embraces epistemological plurality and diversity, reflecting defiant imagination. And they write more about that idea of defiant imagination in that. And I think this point about decolonial imagination is really quite an important one, because it takes into the space that says, yes, there's no easy, we can't just sort of critique and then replace. We have to kind of think, okay, how can this start to look different? And how do we get there with our imagination as researchers to work in different ways? And of course, the other part of that is, and this is kind of, I think, nicely framed by Fanex and Lovo, which is the need to operate with collaborative modes of inquiry, decolonial modes of what he calls convivial research. And that entails for him interconnections, interrelationships, interdependencies, collaboration, co-production, and the recognition of diversity, tolerance, trust, and equality. And so what he's saying, I think the central thing is this move we've seen, and part of that we can see going back to the great book on decolonizing research methods by Linda Tui-Weiss-Smith from New Zealand, right? And ideas of conviviality become really important here, because we're only going to kind of get towards decolonial ideas and imaginations if we're working, or maybe we're just not needed in that. But if we are working with those people, it has to be in a much more collaborative and convivial way than that's often been done, and certainly really the opposite of forms of extractivism. As people know, and I talked about this, I think, at another conference not too long ago in Bangladesh, the idea of entanglements of English. And I've been working with this still a bit to try and grasp the ways that English, if we're going to think about languages, and of course it doesn't only have to be English, we need to understand all the ways they're entwined with material and political and other relations. And of course, you've all heard from Robert Phillipson earlier in this conference, and Robert gives us a very useful view of the kind of top-down imperialism and the interests behind that spread of English. My work has always been more interested in trying to grasp, in a sense, that given that, how then do we understand these, and I've started using this term recently, the entanglements of English. And it very involved, so it's trying to look at how English or other languages is part of social and political relations. That may be north-south political economies, connections to discourse, change, modernization. So these are all discursive things that are happening. Part of local modes of redistribution, right? I mean, so it's very much tied to the economy and how economics distributes and redistributes wealth and other resources. And so the inclusions, exclusion, inequalities that are bound up with that. Linked to modes of communication, and of course that's becoming increasingly fraught and so on with the growth of AI and so on. It's entrenched in educational systems, as we know, and Bangladesh is a good example, but many parts of the world we see how English is there and part of it, and it offers opportunities, but it brings a lot of problems with it. And those often have to do with knowledge, pedagogy, and the curriculum. What else isn't happening when you've got English there doing certain things? And again, Mario Saraceni puts this quite well when he says these entanglements. It is these entanglements we need to understand and take into account every time we discuss English or Englishes in the world in relation to inequality. So the third way of thinking here, and this is, people are probably familiar with this sort of work. This is my recent book that just came out this year on language assemblages. And I was interested that so Lionel Wee, in his book on posthumanist world Englishes, he talks about language as an ongoing project, with different bits added and others removed at various times. So rather than viewing language as an entity with clear boundaries, or as having an autonomous structure, and so rather than looking at varieties such as Singapore English, Thai English, and so on, it's more useful to think in terms of the multiple enactments and assemblages of speakers, language resources, and technologies. And it's the technological affordances that Lionel Wee is particularly interested in. And I think the importance about thinking that way is that it shifts where we start to see, I mean, it's actually quite an agentive view of language, that it's assembled, though we don't need to see it as personally agentive. It can be a much more socially set of produced factors that produce language. But it makes language a production of social practices rather than a given thing that's used. And so in my book, because I've been using the idea of semiotic assemblages to describe many of the places that we've been researching, Emi Otsuji and I and others, to try and understand this sort of complexity of the social world in which language is involved. But I made a distinction in the book between this idea of Lionel Wee's of language assemblages, which can still in some ways be a fairly standard view of language, not standard language, but a standard view of language, that languages, as we understand them, are assembled in human action. So I think we can look at it that way, but we can build from there. And so languages are assembled by their users, and these are what we might call language assemblages. But these are always part of a wider set of semiotic elements, what I call semiotic assemblages. And they're also part of the conglomeration of material artifacts, as a social material assemblages, which, and all of those are part of the action too. So working with assemblages has given me a way of trying to think about the complexity, again, the entanglements, and the entanglements and assemblages sit quite well together. And in one chapter in that book, I tentatively draw some connections between various indigenous ways of thinking about language and assemblages. What I'm trying to be very careful about is not to start to map assemblages onto those worldviews or say they're the same. I'm just saying it seems to me that if you think about assemblages, it's got a flexibility that allows connections to be better made with how we think about languages in communities in relation to land, to country, to water, and so on. A fourth element, and this is in a sense not a solution at all, it's a problem, but I just went back for some recent work to some of these ideas from Claire Cramsh's book on symbolic power. And Claire says, okay, social beings using a social symbolic system, which is how she likes to see language, we are inevitably entangled or implicated in symbolic power struggles to be heard, recognized, respected by others. And so her challenge here is to say, so the question is, as language educators, how can we move towards helping our students to be heard, to be recognized, and to be respected? And that's a very big challenge, right? I mean, so it becomes not one of saying, okay, let's make sure people speak this well or have a good command of that language. It's to say, no, we're actually, as educators, we have to work more carefully to confront the reasons why people may not be heard. Now, those may be linguistic and varieties and aspects of that language, but they're also very much based in gender, in race, and other things. And I think as Senda, I'm sure, was saying this morning, these issues of being heard, recognized, and respected by others can be seen very much in relation to linguistic racism. So as Claire goes on to say, the focus of language education will no longer be exclusive on the individual learner, striving to get his or her message across in a manner conforming to normative grammar of the target language and to the predictable social conventions of the target culture. It will also include making the learners aware of the effects of their utterances, speech acts, and politeness strategies on others. And so my final point in these ways forward is to look at, I've used this a few times, this idea of resourceful speakers. And again, taking up as ever something that Suresh has put very well. And Suresh and I have been back and forth looking at these spatial ideas. And in this paper on spatial repertoires, Suresh says, from a spatial orientation, communicative proficiency involves the ability to align diverse semiotic and spatial resources for a successful activity. And it's this idea of alignment that becomes very interesting, I think. Because what it does is it brings a flexible notion of language assemblages together with an understanding of negotiation and accommodation. So the question again becomes, how can we work towards resourceful speakers, which is less about being proficient in one variety of language and more about finding means of alignment with other speakers. And that becomes a very different kind of challenge for us as language educators. So just to conclude very briefly, what I've been trying to get at here is this: if we take something like Metamorphosis seriously, it poses some very interesting challenges, and particularly if we are prepared to move beyond the kind of World English ELF kind of framework, say, no, we really kind of want to do something very different with what we think language is. So to suggest three things here, then as researchers, we can work with communities to establish the ontological differences that languages entail. And that is to take seriously the idea that languages may be ontologically different from each other. And we're only going to get anywhere near that if we're working convivially, collaboratively with communities. As educators, we can start to think about how we help our students to become resourceful speakers. And this question of how can they be heard as authors of their own worlds? What would that mean for those students? And that it's not to decide what language that should be in, it's to decide how you can be heard and listened to. And as activists, and these aren't necessarily distinct categories, so then we can work towards forms of transformative justice that make alternative lives possible once we've done the colonial, decolonial work, that it makes more things possible in this unequal world we live in. So there are some references if people want to get a quick snapshot. I put a few in underneath some of the slides, but I can just leave that there for a few more seconds. That's some, not all of the references I've used. And that's it. So Kafka and caterpillars, I'm finished. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that made some sense to you. I don't know what it's like as a concluding plenary, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pennycook, for this enlightening session. Now I'd like to invite once again Dr. Hamidur Rahman to come to the stage and finish the keynote address session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pennycook, for a very enlightening and wonderful presentation. And before we started, I was telling our audience that, see, you have written quite a lot. Post-humanist applied linguistics, innovation challenges in applied linguistics, and cultural politics of English as an international language, which I have a copy with your autograph sent to me through Shaila in 2013. I take care of it. I possess it as my dear collection. Thank you. The title was very intriguing. I mean, Kafka, Caterpillar, and Caterpillar Language and Challenges. I think that's a very intriguing title, because in the Metamorphosis novel, Gregory Shamsa is turned into insect, and although he was cared for at the beginning, later on his parents, his sister, they abandoned him, and he sort of committed suicide through starvation. So in that case, the metamorphosis was not positive, it was negative, and because the change was not acceptable to the family and society. But what you are talking about, the change, is the positive one, from caterpillar to butterflies, from tadpole to frogs. I think we are, as we go along, we are facing challenges. We are experiencing paradigm shifts in language study, in language teaching. But we have to carry on our work and understand the changes that we are facing. You have talked about a lot of things, and which are relevant today and which needs to be investigated, talked about, and thought about to guide us in our future researches in language and language teaching. And particularly, you see, I would like to mention your point about being resourceful and being a more egalitarian, and convergence of communication in future. Maybe the question can be asked, in 100 years from now, will there be just one language? Or in an AI-driven world, will people, though talk differently, can communicate with each other through AI technology? So these are changes that we have to face. In the meantime, the decolonization is happening, and assemblages of speech and convergences are likely to happen, I think. And that's particularly, we are very interested in your water epistemology, because on the first day we had a session, colloquium on blue humanities, and which also relate to your speech today. Thank you very much for your very enlightening speech. And although we met you before virtually during the publication of Routledge Handbook on English Language Education in Bangladesh, the second time we have the opportunity to meet you. I hope may you be in good health, and we hope someday you will visit us in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Alastair, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, all right. On behalf of BRAC Institute of Languages, BRAC University, I would like to thank you, and specifically from our advisor, Lady Sarwat Abed, and the entire conference committee. Thank you for being here. And also, thank you for inspiring so many applied linguists and social linguists in Bangladesh. Your books, which came out in 80s and 90s, and even today, all of them, in fact, show us way to understand language and language education better. So thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your recent ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shala. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pennycook and Professor Sultana.